Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Elaine Allen, and I am Public Discourse's managing editor. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event, America After Dobbs. Um, my colleague Jamie Bolding will introduce our all-star panel today, but before he does so, I just wanted to give a brief word about the event today and our purpose for it. So today's conversation is meant to help us launch a resource that we put together a couple of months ago, which is also called America After Dobbs. The resource pulls together our best essays on abortion and the pro-life movement, and it aims to address misconceptions about abortion, such as the claim that women's healthcare depends on access to abortion. And it also explores what's next for the pro-life movement in terms of how to help and support families, and also goals beyond abortion that the pro-life movement might want to focus on in the future. So today's conversation will elaborate on those themes and will help friends of the pro-life movement think about what it should do in these next months and years as we navigate this new era after the Dobbs ruling. So with that, I will turn things over to my colleague, Jamie Bolding, who is our Associate Director of Programs and Development here at the Witherspoon Institute. Thanks, Jamie.
Well, thank you very much, Elaine, and thank you everybody for joining us, everybody who's watching on Zoom and subsequently on YouTube. And as Elaine said, please do check out our special resource on America After Dobbs at Public Discourse. So I'm delighted to say that we're joined by four of the leading voices and most powerful thinkers in the pro-life conversation today. We're joined by Ryan Anderson and Alexandra De Sanctis. I introduced them together because they're both joining us from the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. Ryan and Alexandra are also the co-authors of Tearing Us Apart: How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. And I encourage everybody watching this today to read that book because it's an extremely useful and compelling analysis and summary of where we are in terms of abortion and abortion ethics today. And of course, it came out just a few months ago, so an incredibly timely publication date. And I'm sure that we can get into speaking about the book in different ways during the course of this webinar. As most, if not all of you watching will also know, Ryan is the founding editor of Public Discourse. So we're delighted to have him back today to join us for this conversation. So in addition to Ryan and Alexandra, we're also joined by Richard Doerflinger. He served as Associate Director of Pro-Life Activities at the US Conference of Catholic Bishops and has done an incredible amount of writing and thinking and advocating on the issue of life. And last but by no means least, we're joined by Professor Robert George, who's just appeared on the screen there. Professor George is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the Director of the James Madison Program at Princeton University. So I thank all of them for joining us today. So we have four incredibly powerful voices and thinkers. We only have an hour, unfortunately, to speak with them. So I will keep my introduction very brief and we'll get right down to the questions. I should say that there will also be time for audience questions at the end of this session. So if you have any questions as you're watching on Zoom, please do use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions, and we'll make sure that there's time for them towards the end of the hour. So with that, the webinar, let's get straight into the questions. So my first question is for Ryan Anderson. I'm actually going to kind of ask all of you two questions to begin with. So the first question will be for all of you, which is just I'd be interested in your personal reflections on the Dobbs decision, whether from a personal or professional point of view. This is a huge moment, a momentous moment in US politics and culture. So just how do you feel about the Dobbs decision? How did you feel when the decision came down a few months ago? How are you feeling now about it? So that's a question for everybody. And then I'll add specific questions as well. So for Ryan, if you can speak on your own personal feelings in response to the Dobbs decision. I know you've been advocating on this issue for pretty much your entire career. So speak on that for a minute or two. But also, if Ryan, if you could address where do you think the post-Dobbs abortion debates are going to go? What kind of direction are they going to move in light of Dobbs? What kind of issues can we expect to see given the Dobbs decision a few months ago? So if you could take a few minutes to speak to both of those things. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for organizing this, Jamie, and for inviting me to be a participant. In my, reaction to Dobbs was one of thanksgiving, right? One of about time, one that I'm glad the court finally admitted that they got it wrong 49 and a half years ago. Because Roe v. Wade wasn't just an erroneously decided Supreme Court decision. It was a erroneously decided Supreme Court decision that then facilitated a gross injustice, right? By denying the equal protection of the laws to an entire subcategory of human beings. This then allowed for the slaughter of, over 60 million of our fellow Americans, of our neighbors. And so just euphoria that the court finally admitted they got Roe wrong, they got Casey wrong. Many people thought that this was never going to happen, especially after the Casey plurality opinion. They thought that Republicans are just going to pay lip service to the abortion issue. The Federal Society is just going to appoint justices that, care about their issues. And they were wrong, right? The naysayers were wrong. Pro-lifers who put their hands to the plow, who never lost hope, who never gave up, did the long-term work that was necessary, right? For 49 and a half years, they were doing this work to get to the day that Roe could be overturned. And so I think one would just be gratitude for those who didn't lose hope. One reaction would be now all the new possibilities, right? Because as many people have said, overturning Roe isn't the end of the pro-life cause, it's the beginning of a new phase for the pro-life cause. All right, so then the second question you asked me, what are some of those debates, arguments, battles that we're seeing playing out was first reaction there is that, so much of this was entirely predictable. And in fact, was predicted by many people. The left doesn't actually want to defend its position on abortion, which is unlimited abortion throughout all 9 months of pregnancy at the taxpayer expense. I mean, that is the formal position of the Democratic Party. That's not what they want to talk about, not what they want to defend. Instead, ever since the Alito opinion was leaked, we had endless scaremongering about whether or not contraception would be the next right that was taken away, or gay marriage would be taken away, or I think most ludicrous were the people saying that Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion meant that he would vote to do away with interracial marriage. Right? People who seemingly have no idea who Ginny Thomas is. So a lot of effort by the media and by the left, but I repeat myself, to talk about anything other than abortion, talk about these other things that poll better, et cetera, et cetera. And then second, insofar as they did talk about abortion, it was, to my mind, intentionally misleading the public about what pro-life laws do and do not do. And so it's good that we have Alexandra with us, both Alexandra for the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and then a team of, I think it was 2 researchers at the Charlotte Lozier Institute, went through every state pro-life law and documented that each and every one of them has explicit protections for medical care that is medically necessary for the mother, right? That none of the pro-life laws that prohibit elective abortions, that prohibit lethal violence in the womb, prohibit life-saving medical care for mothers whose pregnancy might be causing the underlying health issue, or where they have an underlying health issue like cancer, and where the treatment for the cancer might result in the foreseen but unintended death of the child. So I forget how many weeks ago now, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we put out a statement from pro-life scholars. Robbie signed it, Alexandra signed it, a number of prominent bioethicists and other moral philosophers and theologians signed it, making clear that pro-life laws that allow for medicine that protects the bodily health and life of the mother do not violate the pro-life principle. Those aren't even exceptions, properly speaking. All right, the other thing I'll say just about, direction of the debate was it has not at all been surprising that many leaders of the Republican Party don't want to have to defend their position on abortion either. They don't want to have to talk about the right to life for the unborn, especially federally elected, office holders of federal authority. They don't want to talk about a federal role here, right? So they don't want to talk about whether it's a 20-week bill or Lindsey Graham's most recently introduced 15-week bill. They want to say that this is just a state's issue. And so in terms of future directions, I think it's going to be important to see that there's a role both for the states and for the federal government. And then future debates within the pro-life movement. I think, you know, it's good that we have Robbie with us, because there's a big debate about how to properly understand the 14th Amendment, how to understand the word person in the 14th Amendment, and whether or not unborn human beings should qualify as persons for the purpose both of constitutional law, but then also for Congress under its Section 5 authority on the 14th Amendment. So those are some of the future directions. It's what we've seen played out. And I'm going to turn it over to whoever is next.
Well, thank you, Ryan. That was incredibly helpful. And there are so many threads in what you just say, and I'm hoping that we can explore some of those threads in this hour, including what you just mentioned on the 14th Amendment. So next, I turn to Alexandra, your co-author on this. So the same initial question to Alexandra, just on a personal level or a professional level. You know, how do you think about the Dobbs decision? How did you think at the time? How are you thinking about it now, given that it's been a few months? And then the second question specifically, and again, this is something Ryan just mentioned on states. Could you say a few words about what's been going on in the states, different states in the wake of the Dobbs decision? I know that's one of the focuses of your reporting. You know, the states now have a chance for the first time in nearly half a century or so to set their own abortion policy. So what have we seen so far in different states, and what might we expect to see going forward at the state level?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for hosting this event and for including me on this incredible panel. I would, you know, a couple of years ago would have just been watching these all-stars thinking how cool they were, and now I get to be on the panel. So that's pretty neat. Well, anyway, Ryan just took most of my ideas, so I'll try and add a few that he didn't reference, but I should be used to this by now. But yeah, of course, Dobbs was a huge win, and I was thrilled. I've been pro-life my whole life and have always wanted to do, you know, my small part to try and get rid of Roe v. Wade, to help the unborn child, to help their mothers, to build a culture of life. And I never envisioned that at such a young age, I would see Roe v. Wade tossed out. I certainly hoped it would happen even in my lifetime, but 6 years into my career, I never would have seen that coming. So I'm thrilled and surprised. And of course, like Ryan said, grateful to everybody who has been doing this for much, much longer than I have, fighting the good fight to get us here. Now, as to where we go from here, the situation in the states is essentially you have about half of the states that have meaningful, robust protections for unborn children. Many of those are laws that were kind of on the books that were set to take effect if and when Roe v. Wade was overturned. Many of them are things that are kind of still working their way through the courts, or have only just recently kind of had resolved legal battles where they were being challenged in the courts because of Roe v. Wade being in place. But now states are able to put them into place. So things like heartbeat laws in many states that protect unborn children after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. And then there's a handful of those 25 or so states that have something like a 15-week ban or a slightly less protective restriction on abortion. So that's a good thing, right? About half the states, but the rest of them are still very much up for grabs. So there are states like California, of course, on the very far left end of the spectrum, New York, Illinois, places that want to become abortion sanctuaries, right? So at the same time, over the last couple of years, as we saw pro-life states trying to put in place heartbeat bills or total protections for unborn children, we saw blue states create laws or pass laws creating a fundamental right to abortion, right? So laws that make it impossible to, just to give one example, require that parents give consent or even be notified before a minor girl seeks an abortion. Things like this. California is trying to become an abortion sanctuary, right? That's what Gavin Newsom calls it. He wants it to be a place where when employers hand out the travel benefits to employees seeking an abortion out of state, California is the first place that they go. So that's on the far left end of the spectrum. And then I'd say there's like maybe a third or so of the states that are kind of up for grabs, where there's a live debate over where abortion policy is going to go. One of them that's at the top of my mind right now is Michigan, where there's going to be a ballot measure. And Michigan residents have to vote on whether or not they want to create a constitutional right, a fundamental right to, as they're calling it, reproductive freedom in the language of the ballot. But it would essentially create a total right to abortion at any point for any reason, and no restrictions at all really would be permitted, not even health and safety regulations on clinics, or like I mentioned, parental consent, parental notification. So there's still a very live battle for those states. And so I think it's going to be very much a case by case, the pro-life movement has to focus on one state at a time as these become big battles. And then simultaneously, kind of like Ryan referenced, the Republican Party is in the middle of a bit of a fight over whether or not there's a congressional role here, whether or not there's a federal role to protect unborn children, because a house divided cannot stand, right? We can't go forward as a country with half of our states protecting unborn children and the other half with some hodgepodge of protections or total abortion free-for-alls. So to my mind, there is a federal role, but I'm not sure that the right is quite there yet.
Thank you very much. And once again, I hope we'll have time to explore some of those issues that you raised a bit further in the hour. Let me turn to Richard, who has had a very long and distinguished and successful career writing and thinking and advocating on the question of life. So same initial question to Rich, just on a personal level and looking back on your career and your advocacy, how do you feel when you learned about the Dobbs decision? How are you feeling today, a few months later? And then second question, to the extent that it's possible, looking forward, thinking about the pro-life movement, where does the pro-life movement go from here? What strategies might be most effective in terms of passing pro-life laws, in terms of just navigating the political and cultural challenges that will no doubt arise in light of this success? So just thinking ahead and to the extent that it's possible to predict the future, it's always difficult to do that, but thinking about the future of the pro-life movement as you see it.
Okay, well, I mean, obviously I was gratified by the Dobbs decision itself as well, and it was masterfully done, I thought, and it pulled together all of the dissents from Roe that had been made by many justices and even pro-choice legal experts over the last 50 years. What I think surprised me, and maybe we shouldn't have been surprised, is the panic and anger and sometimes violence or threatened violence that emerged on the other side. We should not have been surprised because the law is a teacher. And for almost half a century, people were being taught by the law that this is a basic right of a woman. When Planned Parenthood versus Casey said that a whole generation had grown up relying on abortion as a backup if contraception should fail, that people had ordered their lives around that possibility, they weren't wrong. That reliance was based on a lie, but there was a kind of panic right away. And that panic has been fueled into a political force by misinformation and lies by the supporters of abortion. And I think we cannot, it's impossible to exaggerate the challenge that we face. I want to offer a dose of realism here. In many states and at the federal level, I think we're going to be spending a lot of our efforts simply trying to block really bad laws, extreme legislation on the other side. At the federal level, if you want to see what our opponents have planned, they laid it out years ago. It's called the Blueprint for Sexual and Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice. It's online. It's over 100 pages long. And if you look at the executive actions they call for, Joe Biden is just checking them off, every one, no matter how extreme they are. Their flagship legislation, the Women's Health Protection Act, is far, far more sweeping than Roe itself. It would overturn hundreds of state laws that were in effect under Roe. You won't even be able to say in your state law that abortions have to be done by a doctor or have health regulations for women, regulating dangerous clinics. And that's one of my themes also, is that we have got to emphasize in legislation and in our education that we are talking about concern for the woman as well, that we are more concerned for the woman than the other side is. I mean, that's what switched Abby Johnson from Planned Parenthood clinic director to being pro-life. Not only was she horrified by the sight of an ultrasound and abortion, she realized that the protesters outside cared more about her than her own boss did. So we need to be asking, who are the real extremists here? These guys who want abortion without question, without apology, and with public funding throughout the 9 months? Or is it people who are trying to make some incremental changes to begin to offer protection to the unborn? And I am very staunch believer in incremental legislation. I don't think that, if you are taking a first step that in any way authorizes or gives a blessing to the things you cannot protect or work about right now. We need to be taking first steps because we need to start with where people are. And if to begin a legislative strategy, you have to realize what that is, and you have to pay attention to public opinion. You have to pay attention to the public sentiment. It is not anywhere near as extreme on the other side as our opponents say. Most people have ambivalent feelings about it. They are very concerned about later term abortions. They are concerned about totally elective abortions. They're going to want to see some exceptions for what they see as the hard cases, and those have to be argued out and educated on in their own way. I mean, I've been a fan at the federal level of looking at that 20-week ban again, which has been passed 3 times by the House of Representatives in past Congresses, and has not been able to make headway in the Senate thus far. And here are the reasons. It was talked about protecting a pain-capable unborn child, and that's true. But it's also the stage at which, according to a study committee of the AMA some years ago, is more dangerous to the woman's life than a delivery is. That it's more likely to end the woman's life. That abortion at the time Roe v. Wade was handed down was defined by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists as the deliberate interruption of pregnancy before 20 weeks. What is a post-20-week abortion? It's infanticide. It's a legal fiction created by the Supreme Court. Even the OBGYNs didn't say that was an abortion before. And it bans, and people, pro-life people are going to be disappointed at this, it bans very few abortions, but they are the most grotesque, indefensible of abortions. And you have to start somewhere to provide some kind of floor for, let's at least say, a state cannot go farther than this. So I am in favor of looking at that in a realistic way. We'll have to wait to see what the midterm elections give us. And I think, and Texas and Missouri have showed the way on this. Both of the states, when they passed their pro-life laws, also stepped up their support for pregnant women and their children. And we always need to have that side by side with any protections for the unborn. The Catholic Bishops Conference started 2 years ago with a project called Walking with Moms in Need. And they were going out to all the dioceses saying, check in your parishes. Every parish should know what the resources are from social services, Catholic charities, pregnancy aid centers in your area. And if they're not good enough, support them, create them. The Bishops Conference has also supported something at the federal level called the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act and increasing the child tax credit. There are many other ways to go after those problems. And Patrick Brown has a pro-family policy agenda that I think Robbie and I and others here probably have signed on to and endorsed.
Richard, if I could, sorry to jump in, Richard. If I could, I think that the pro-family point, I was gonna get to it later in the conversation, if that's okay with you.
That's fine.
Thank you so much. Just to bring in the fourth panelist, Professor Robert George. Thank you for joining us. So same first question to Professor George, just on a personal level. How did you feel about the Dobbs decision? How are you feeling about it today? And then second question, and this is something that Ryan touched on, and I think also referenced in Richard's comments, question on the Constitution. To what extent is there a right to life as a constitutional right? And will the Supreme Court take up this this question or this issue of an affirmative right to life, including right to unborn life in the Constitution? So Professor George, I think just before Dobbs came down, you had an op-ed in the Washington Post with Josh Craddock, I think, on this question. And you wrote, it will be the duty of Congress following Dobbs to enforce constitutional rights for the unborn through federal legislation. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution entitles unborn children to the protection, indeed the equal protection of the law. So I wonder if you could just kind of summarize that issue for people who may not be familiar with the constitutional theory, and say a few words about how you think that might play out in the months and years ahead, the constitutional right to life.
Certainly. First, though, thank you, Jamie, and thanks to Elaine and Public Discourse and the Witherspoon Institute for having this little presentation and for inviting me to be part of it. It is always a pleasure to be in a pro-life discussion or on a pro-life program with Richard Dorflinger. He is a hero of this movement, and I've found his work and his witness inspiring in my own pro-life endeavors. And how great it is to see outstanding, brilliant, courageous young men and women like Zan, Alexandra DeSantis, and Ryan Anderson, my former research assistant and sometime co-author in the movement. I've got enormous optimism, not just hope. I've got plenty of hope, but also optimism about our movement going forward, precisely because we have such extraordinary talent. And again, not only are these young men and women, and so many like Alexandra and Ryan, brilliant, but they're brave. And it's going to take that bravery to move the ball ahead here toward our goal of making sure that every child is protected by law and welcomed in life, and that every mother who is facing a difficult, problematic pregnancy has the support that she needs from a movement that equally values and loves mother and child. Jamie, I was recruited into the pro-life movement by my mother when I was an adolescent. And when I was 16 or 17 years old, on January 22nd, 1973, I could work out my exact age if I did the arithmetic. On that day, the day Roe versus Wade was handed down, I was working a pro-life table at West Virginia University, which is near where I lived. I was a high school student at the time, and I ended up going to a different place for college, but I was working a table at the student center called the Mountain Lair, handing out pro-life literature. And we were already in the struggle because some states like New York and California and Colorado had already removed legal protection from many unborn children, and we wanted to reverse that trend. But a student walked by our table and called over to us and said, "Hey, there's been a big decision on your issue from the Supreme Court." And we said, "Well, what was it? What was the ruling?" And he said, "I don't know, but I know there's been a big decision. I heard about it." So we rushed to find a radio. Of course, in those days, you couldn't instantly look things up online. We rushed to find a radio and then had to wait until it was on the hour for the news. And then we got the very bad news that Roe versus Wade had removed all protection from unborn children. The initial reports were that protections had been removed only for the first trimester. It was much worse than that, as you know. Protections were removed all the way through 24 weeks and very substantially weakened even beyond that. So it was a devastating decision for me when I was a boy, already involved in the movement. But like every other pro-life person I knew, my mother, my friends, the people I was working with, we said on that day, this will not stand. We will not permit this to stand. We will not have this violation of human dignity, violation of human rights, entrenched in our constitutional law, made to be part of the very essence of our civil order and our understanding of basic rights. And so we all went to work that day to get the decision reversed. And then 49 years, 5 months, and 2 days later, after enormous exertions by so many people, many of whom did not live to see the day, many of our great heroes, Richard, you know who I'm talking about, people like Mildred Jefferson and Dr. Jack Wilkie and so many, Henry Hyde, didn't live to see the day, but we were blessed to live to see the day when Roe fell in the Dobbs decision, and the American people regained their right to legislate in defense of the life of the child in the womb. So obviously, I was very grateful for this decision, gratified that our labors had finally paid off. I knew we had plenty of work ahead of us in the legislative domain to protect unborn children. I was very gratified. At the same time, I must say my very first reaction was to think of Lincoln's second inaugural address and his words in closing that we must move forward with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And that's because I recognize that the people we have labored against for all these years, the people who have sought to protect what in their best judgment is a right, a fundamental woman's right to abortion, are not bad people. They have embraced a bad ideology, but they are not bad people. They're doing what they think is right. They care about women. They care about women who are in difficult circumstances. They care about women's futures and their right to participate equally in society. We mustn't demonize our opponents. Many of them obviously demonize us, but we needn't repay that with demonization. Our motto going forward should be Lincoln's, with malice toward none and with charity for all, but with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. And now we face great challenges because those on the other side have been energized politically. They deeply believe in their cause as we believe in ours. They understand it, I would say misunderstand it, but they understand it on their terms to be a great moral crusade, and they mean to win. They don't recognize what we recognize, the fundamental dignity of the child in the womb, the principle of the profound inherent and equal dignity of each and every member of the human family. So we have to be firm, we have to be tough, we have to fight hard, we have to be smart, but with charity for all and with malice toward none. Now, you've asked me about the constitutional question. In Dobbs, Professor John Finnis, the magisterial professor of philosophy of law at Oxford University, who was actually my doctoral dissertation supervisor and great mentor and friend, and I joined together to submit an amicus curiae brief, a friend of the court brief, making the case to the Supreme Court that the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, properly interpreted by reference to the original understanding of the provision, the original meaning, public meaning of the words, confers basic protections on unborn children such that elective abortion cannot be permitted under the Constitution. There are different questions that arise when procedures need to be performed to protect maternal health, and as Ryan pointed out, we're all in favor of those procedures, the permission of those procedures, certainly when they're necessary to protect the life of the mother. Sometimes there are tragedies where a procedure that is required for maternal health is going to result in fetal death, not as an intended end, but as a foreseen and accepted side effect. Those are not, strictly speaking, actually, they're not abortions, or what are called direct abortions. And those have to be accounted for in any legislation that protects the unborn child, because after all, we treat child and mother as equal. Neither one is superior to the other in worth and dignity. But as far as elective abortion is concerned, that is abortion where the child's life presents no threat to the mother's life. Well, that's not consistent. The permission of that killing is not consistent with the personhood of the unborn child. Now, why do Dr. Finnis and I say, Professor Finnis and I say, that on an originalist interpretation of the 14th Amendment, that is, understanding the 14th Amendment by reference to the original public meaning of the words, why do we say that the unborn are persons? It's because there is a mountain, or to shift the metaphor, an avalanche of evidence from medicine, from law, from writings of the time, that person in 1868, when the 14th Amendment was ratified and became part of our Constitution, meant all living members of the human species, the human race, including the child in the womb, expressly including the child in the womb. If you look at cases, if you look at treatises, if you look at medical works, if you look at legal works, you'll see that there's a consistent message that the unborn are protected. And this was the very period when, by statute, state after state after state, in a campaign led by the American Medical Association, as a matter of fact, were strengthening common law prohibitions of elective abortion. That was the result of a scientific breakthrough in the 1820s that gave rise to modern human embryology, and that was the discovery of the mammalian ovum by Carl von Baer. Prior to that discovery, that scientific breakthrough, no one really knew how life began, how human beings came into existence, or other mammals came into existence, what the earliest stages of development were really like. The discovery of the mammalian ovum made clear that you have continuous development of an organism that comes into being as a distinct, genetically and functionally distinct organism at conception, and then develops through a gapless process, self-directed gapless process from the embryonic into and through the fetal, infant, child, and adolescent stages, ultimately into adulthood, with his or her identity, determinateness, unity fully intact. Once that was known, then we had a sea change in our understanding of the status of the child in the womb, and the law shifted across the states to take that into account. So all that Professor Finnis and I have asked the court to do is to recognize that the 14th Amendment, properly understood by reference to its original public meaning, already protects the child in the womb. Now, the court did not go that far in Dobbs, but certainly the analysis that we offered fully justifies congressional action to rectify wrongs done by states when those states fail to protect children from elective abortions.
Thank you very much, Professor George. Thank you for that. At this point, since we've been down the panel once, I'll just remind the audience that they're very welcome to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll make time at the end for some audience questions. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go down the panel one more time, one more question for each panelist, and then we'll open things up to audience questions if there are any. And I also have many more questions of my own. So let me go back to the beginning with, well, let me actually go to Alexandra, if that's okay. So, you know, one of the reasons we're doing this today is because of the Public Discourse's special resource on Dobbs, and particularly myths and misconceptions arising from Dobbs, or that people often have related to abortion ethics. And, you know, one of the big things we've heard in the last few months is that, you know, abortion is bad for women. Sorry, the restricting abortion is bad for women. It's restricting women's freedom and autonomy, and we're all familiar with these arguments. So my question for you, and I was struck in the book, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, you talk about how abortion harms women, right? So I wondered if you could, you know, say some a few words about that on the issue of women specifically, and the harm that abortion does to women that you talk about in the book.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I think the most compelling argument for abortion, though I think it still fails, is the claim that women will somehow be disadvantaged without it, right? And so I think it's important for pro-lifers to take this argument seriously and learn how to reject it, because I think it's not only is abortion not necessary for women, I think it's actively harmful to women, but it's important for pro-lifers to learn how to speak in those terms, I think, which is what we tried to do in the second chapter of our book, is kind of lay out the case. So I'll briefly summarize what we argue. First, we look at two ways in which abortion harms women. The first is the way it harms women who've actually had abortions. And so there we look at the physical risks of abortion, the physical risks of chemical abortion drugs, particularly self-administered at home with no doctor's visit, which is increasingly what abortion supporters are pushing for, legally speaking, and which is now permissible, unfortunately. We look at the sort of long-term health consequences to women who've had abortions. So this could be things like an increased risk of breast cancer, particularly from abortions later in pregnancy, an increased risk of preterm birth or other complications in future pregnancies, a risk of infertility in future, attempting to conceive later in life. So all sorts of physical risks. And then also psychological risks or psychological after effects for women who had an abortion. We know it's actually quite common for women to suffer crippling guilt and regret after the fact, or drug and alcohol abuse, perhaps even suicidal ideation or suicide as a result of having chosen abortion. And of course, this is unfortunate on its own terms, but that the difficulty of this situation is compounded by the fact that abortion supporters either ignore these women's stories outright or attack them, actively attack women who share stories of suffering after having had an abortion. And so I think it's important for pro-lifers to acknowledge, accept, welcome these women when they come forward with their stories. But then the second point we make in the chapter is that abortion actually harms all women, not just women who've had abortions. And the way it does this is the idea of abortion really takes the male body as the norm, right? It treats pregnancy, fertility, childbearing as some kind of aberration, and it treats infertile sex essentially as the norm, right? The fact that men can just walk away from sex is taken as not only normal, but the ideal. And then abortion is kind of this technological method whereby women are supposed to emulate men. And so I think the sort of cultural, the widespread cultural and legal acceptance of abortion as a solution of some kind to the female body has created a society that in which women feel like they need abortion to catch up, right? If the workplace values this supposedly unattached, always available man, then women are going to be made to feel like motherhood, childbearing, even marriage sometimes is a disadvantage. And being home with children or wanting to work part-time or wanting to be available to the home more than your average male worker is treated as a problem. And so abortion is the solution. And lo and behold, we see corporations pledging to help women obtain abortions if they need them so they can stay in the workplace. So I'd say that's just one small symptom, but it's a whole mindset of, abortion is kind of this Band-Aid to make women more like men.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me turn to Ryan. And in fact, at this point, given our time constraints, I'll just start kind of incorporating the audience questions which have been coming through into some of my questions to the panel. So Ryan, a couple of questions have come through related to state legislators, state initiatives on abortion. So a couple of questions here, and you can engage with one or two of them or use them as a jumping off point. So one question is, how do we educate state legislators who are moving forward on this issue, but in many ways, perhaps according to the questioner, without the kind of nuance and charity that we're seeing on this panel? So how do we help educate the people who are responsible for devising and implementing new laws in the future? So that's one question. And a second question that's come through is, should a state that can pass a very broad prohibition of abortion do so? There's a certain kind of basic intuitive sense to that, but there are also ways in which you can imagine that might backfire. So should states try to pass very broad prohibitions of abortion if they're able to, or should there be a kind of different approach? So I'll put that to Ryan, and maybe Robbie and Rich also have thoughts on those questions. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. Briefly, the first question about how to work with state policymakers is more or less every state has a family policy council or a family policy institute. They also have a Catholic conference for the state, and many of them also have a Southern Baptist committee. Those are normally your three most active kind of scholarly activist lobbyist groups that work at the State House. And so, get in touch with them and see how you can help their efforts. Because what they're doing, I work with a lot of these Catholic conferences and family policy councils, and they're in daily contact during legislative season with the good guys engaged in these policy debates. And they're trying to do their best to educate them both so they have the nuance and so that they have the right rhetoric, right? So that they speak both veritas and caritate, right? I mean, we want to have both. The public discourse resource that this webinar is based around, the articles that the editors have highlighted, if you look through the different, I think it's like 9 different myths and then like the future direction, those are great resources. I mean, the thing that I love about public discourse is everything is readable in like 5 minutes, right? These aren't academic law journal essays that take an hour to sit down These are meant to be digestible. And the public discourse pulling together of many of these resources, that's only a fraction of the PD archives that touch on the right to life and touch on abortion. There's even more good content. So if you're a new reader to public discourse, realize we now have, I think it's 14 years of resources at public discourse. There's also a whole host of other publications and think tanks doing work. Look at Zan's work at EPPC, look at Erica Bakyaki's work, look at Patrick Brown's work. So that would be one answer there. To the second question, I think the EPPC statement that I mentioned earlier, where the first part of it said that laws that allow the protection of the mother's health do not violate the pro-life norm. The second half of that statement also was a defense of what Richard earlier referred to as incrementalism, a principled incrementalism. And what I take the force of the question being is that you might have a numerical majority today to pass a very broad pro-life law that actually then gets struck down by your activist state courts, or then gets overturned by the citizens during the next election cycle, which may, in the long run, actually do more damage to the pro-life cause than good. So the principled incrementalism part here is not just what is the most pro-life law that you can get enacted today. It's what is the most pro-life law that would have staying power. And that may mean doing something slightly less than what you could accomplish today in order to then incrementally build the base of support for it. The flip side of this is that law is also a teacher, as Richard also mentioned. So as you pass a good pro-life law, it's going to shape public opinion, which is simply to say some of these are, rather difficult prudential questions that are going to be best addressed by the people on the ground in the jurisdiction that know, what sort of support do we have? What sort of opposition? Where's public opinion? Where's, are we going to get boycotted by the NBA, et cetera? You need to think about that stuff. Last thing I'll say, none of that should be an excuse for cowardice, right? One fear that I have is that when we do rightfully defend principle incrementalism, that then gets used by people who are politically cowardly as an excuse to do nothing, right? And so we need to have this, it's a set of a series of tensions on both sides, and how do we titrate it correctly?
Thank you. I'd just like to return to Richard. I apologize, Richard, when you were still in your flow. In the previous question, you were about to say some more about pro-family policy, and that was going to be one of my questions in this webinar. Is one of the big debating points, that one of the directions the debate has taken or could potentially take is, in light of Dobbs, to what extent should we be focusing on pro-family policy, more broadly understood beyond the specific issue of abortion? How do we support families? How do we support parents, mothers, especially? So I know you were about to say more about that. We were discussing that just before we went live. So if you could just for a couple of minutes, just say more about your thoughts on the pro-family policy agenda in light of Dobbs.
Yes, well, I mean, there is a great, falsehood that rules the arguments for public funding for abortion. You say, well, if we're funding childbirth, then we should be equally funding abortion. Okay, abortion costs maybe early abortion costs maybe $300, and raising a child to the age of 18 costs $300,000. So, according to some federal agency that looks at such things. So how do we equalize that? Well, we should be funding support for mothers and their children about 1,000 times more than any amount put into abortion. So, we're talking about making unpaid family leave. I was part of the effort to pass the Family and Medical Leave Act in Congress. The one time I appeared on a platform with the NOW, but we could not at that time get paid family leave, paid maternity leave required of all large employers. We should fight for that. We should fight for more childcare options, including options for women to have more flex time to take care of their own children when they can, and to have more flexible working hours. We should be looking at, obviously, support for pregnancy aid centers and for pregnancy support. One of the, early in this whole debate, we had as an advisor, a very respected advisor, the pro-life attorney, John Noonan, who was later a federal judge himself. And he said, well, can you just, in your tax policies, can you just tax abortion income to the tune of, say, 90%? And then all the revenues raised from that goes into support for women and their children. Locally here in Washington State, we have the Catholic Charities doing, it's called a Prepares program, pregnancy and parenting support. And they have volunteers that actually spend 5 years with a mother and her child, her family, to provide and get them connected with any resources they might need up until the child is in kindergarten. So that's quite an answer to you only care about children up until birth and then you forget about them. Why don't we put some public funding behind a system like that, so that women are not feeling alone in all this and have help navigating these social services. So there's a million different things to do, as Patrick Brown says in laying out this family policy agenda. He says putting these into concrete particulars is going to take creativity and some hard thinking. We may need to be also bringing back the now largely abandoned idea of the maternity home, which is now largely privately funded, privately run. But why don't we have that as a public need for women who don't know where else to turn when they're having their child? The other great unaddressed need, because it has become culturally almost unacceptable. I think there are people who have tried to make it culturally unacceptable, is making an adoption plan. And there are some cultural as well as legal reasons for that. It's almost impossible to make a confidential adoption plan that's not open to later ready searching by the grown child and others. And a lot of women are scared of that. And then they say, well, they're told the only confidential option you have is abortion. There are so many different things we could do in order to be helpful to women facing this situation and convincing them that abortion is not their only choice and that they have support.
Thank you very much, Richard. Turning again to Professor George, I was really pleased to hear him reference Lincoln's second inaugural with malice towards none and charity for all. I know that Professor George, I think, tweeted that out on the day that the Dobbs decision came down. And so my question is on this, and it really gets to a broader topic that Professor George specializes in, which is freedom of debate, open discourse, civil discourse. How do we engage with people on the other side of fundamental, political and ethical divisions and differences? So, Professor George, you touched on the importance of recognizing that there are many people in America who experience the Dobbs decision as a bad thing, as a cause for concern or even fear. So just to end up where we have about 5 minutes left, which is not anywhere near enough time, but I'd love to hear more of your insights and reflections on specific ways we might be able to reach out and to reach across the divides in light of Dobbs and have some of these civil and constructive conversations.
Well, very good. First, I repeat, do not demonize anybody. Do not demonize your opponents. Even if they are demonizing you, which sometimes they will do not repay that with demonizing them. We have to exemplify love, frankly, in all that we do. We don't want to sully a very noble cause by prosecuting it in an ignoble way. And that's hard because people are passionate about the sanctity of human life. I certainly am. And of course, people on the other side are passionate as well. And we need to recognize that the concerns that motivate them are legitimate concerns. Caring about the health of women, caring about women's equality. Those are important concerns. We need to address them, not by licensing the killing of unborn children, but we need to address them in ways that are appropriate. We know, especially in this late season of our experience, that the problem of abortion is multifactorial, to use that term from the social sciences. There's not just one reason that some women seek abortions or are driven to seek abortions. There are many reasons. Sometimes it's abuse. Sometimes it's pressure from husbands, boyfriends, parents, employers. Sometimes it's poverty. It can be many different things. And all of those have to be addressed. And some of them can be addressed politically or legislatively, and others can only be addressed culturally, and some can best be addressed by a combination of legal and cultural moves or initiatives. We need to be smart about those things, not simply to advance our cause of protecting the unborn child, but because justice to women does require that. And I think most pro-life people understand. My mother did, going all the way back to 1971, when she got involved in the movement 2 years before Roe versus Wade. And all of the people I have ever worked with in the movement understand that as well. Now, next point. The great thing about being on the pro-life side of this debate, while it's not the side shared with cultural elites, and you get a lot of abuse, and you're sometimes discriminated against, and you're victimized, and you're called names and all that. I got all that. But one nice thing about it is we have nothing to fear from evidence, argument, or reason. We have nothing to fear from the science. There are no scientific facts we have to cover or hide. There's no language games we have to engage in order to manipulate the rhetoric to make it serve our cause. The more every American knows about the science of human embryogenesis and intrauterine human development, the better, as far as I'm concerned, the better as far as every pro-lifer is concerned. There's nothing we don't want people to. We want them to know all of it, because all of it militates in favor of the proposition that each and every member of the human family from the earliest developmental stage is just that, a member of the human family, who therefore, if we're true to our philosophical principles, is a bearer of profound inherent and equal dignity and deserves to be protected in law and loved and welcomed in life. So making the case, we need to make the case. Everyone should master the science. It's not that complicated, actually. It's straightforward. And the more we know, and the more that science proceeds, the stronger the case for the unborn child. As I said, it goes really all the way back to about 1826, 1827. All the developments forward from that just support the cause that we have devoted ourselves to. And the philosophical argument, which can be made in religious terms, but need not be made in religious terms, again, is very straightforward. We as a people, we as a civilization really are committed to the proposition that each and every member of the human family is created equal. Well, all we're asking is for all human beings to be accorded their rights under that principle of equality. That's it. There are no second and third class human beings. All human beings are first class human beings. All human beings deserve protection in every stage and every condition, just as we do not tolerate treating people differently or treating them as inferiors because of race or sex or ethnicity. The same should be true. We should not treat anybody as inferior because of age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency or location or anything else. So let's just go out and make the case. It's a relatively easy case to make. The science is clear. We know we have a human being from the very formation of the embryo, from the earliest embryonic stage. And the principle is not some novel thing or some religious dogma. The principle is the one articulated in our very Declaration of Independence, the principle of equality, that all are created equal.
Thank you, Professor George. And I think that's a wonderful way in which to conclude the webinar. It seems terribly inadequate that we only had 1 hour, but I know that time is at a premium, and we really do appreciate you all four of you taking the time to join us for this hour, for this webinar. And we appreciate and honor the work that all four of you have done throughout your careers on this question of life, protecting and supporting and advancing life, and the role that you all played in helping to bring about the Dobbs decision and the direction that we go on through here. And we'll continue to follow your work both at Public Discourse and beyond. I'd also like to thank everybody who joined us today on Zoom for this webinar and through Facebook and subsequently on YouTube. We'll be posting this on YouTube shortly. Thank you all for joining us. Please continue to read Public Discourse and to check the America After Dobbs resource, which we will continue to update as we publish more essays on this extremely fundamental political and cultural issue. So it just leaves it for me to bring this webinar to a conclusion. Thank you all again very much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.